I don't know if this is working, if you can hear me with this. It's okay? Thanks, I'm really delighted to be here talking to you. Yeah, I wasn't sure how much to change the talk I gave from the TEDx one, and I changed it a good bit. It's based on the same research. I thought I'd start with a bit of a taster of some of the ideas I'm going to share with you. A lot of my research is based originally on film, but it was that idea about film becoming more and more realistic, and we know that currently big organizations are kind of investing in VR, and then film looks like it's moving into this kind of VR platform. So looking at the psychology of realism in film also very much applies to the psychology of film in VR. And I'm interested in this idea of the illusion of non-mediated reality, which all sorts of fiction kind of presents to viewers. And I started thinking about the development of film and how from the very first films from the start over 100 years ago, these films became more and more realistic. And through technological developments, we saw things like the talkies and CGI and high definition. And it looks like that as these technological developments progress, film in some ways is becoming more and more realistic. And this all seemed to culminate in films like Avatar, where it kind of one of the highest kind of blockbuster grossing films of all time, and it was made famous by its use of all these new technologies. But there's something a little bit strange about saying that this is realistic. And when I'm trying to do my research around this topic, this idea of these giant blue aliens running around, in one way we all kind of, oh yeah, I know what you mean when you say it's realistic, but it's not realistic. And it kind of linked in with a lot of the discussions I had about Jurassic Park when I was younger. When I saw this film, I was blown away by these realistic dinosaurs. I got to see dinosaurs in real life. I got to see these actors, or they weren't actors, these characters touching them and running from them in broad daylight. Someone was saying, it's not really realistic, I mean, they're dinosaurs. I'm like, no, but it seems real. I go, well, actually, you know, dinosaurs don't look like that. We know that now. They have feathers and that sort of stuff. And then I'm like, you know what I mean? I mean, it feels real. And I think this idea of realism, this definition of realism, and what we're talking about when we say realism, it's kind of like happiness. Everyone knows what it is, but no one really defines it. And I was interested in that idea. And what was particularly interesting is this, technological advances to make everything more realistic, whatever that means. And at the same time, things like shadow puppets or spoken word stories just from all sorts of other media that aren't realistic at all or aren't technologically advanced can make our emotions soar. And so I was interested in this interaction between realism and our emotions and what realism is. And from my work, I'm trying to argue that we need to conceptualize realism not in terms of the qualities of the technology, but we need to start thinking about the context in which the brain makes those sorts of decisions, and the way in which it processes information. So, yeah, we need to look at the way in which people decide around what is realistic. One interesting idea that I thought was good was that we could say something is realistic to the extent that someone behaves the same way as they would if it was not a mediated experience. I like that one, but there's plenty of debate in this area, and it's coming from all sorts of different disciplines. Computer science have ideas, philosophers have ideas, psychologists have ideas, and more these interdisciplinary ideas are forcing us to go back to the very basics, and I'm really interested in that. I have a master's in neuropsychology and perception and a doctorate in cognitive and emotional engagement with entertainment media, and it was through that work I'm trying to merge those ideas of media psychology by looking at how we kind of how our psychology works in the context of media, and cognitive psychology, which has an emphasis on those internal mental processes. I'm interested in the way people process and respond to fabricated dynamic information, and what are the factors involved in thinking or feeling that something is real, natural, fictional, fabricated. because I think if we can look at the way the brain processes that information, then we can start to get a sense of where we should be honing in manipulating the technology in some way. So yeah, this is the same sort of idea, this interaction between the unconscious and the conscious. See, one of the things we know about the way we process information is that we do so in two broad ways, so we can talk about it that way. And that if anyone is further interested in that, there's a really great book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, which talks about the way the brain processes information. And essentially there's these two ways, this unconscious automatic response, so that if someone was to throw something at me right now, fortunately I would hopefully be able to move out of the way before I knew what it was they threw and why they threw it and all that sort of stuff. So there's this automatic response to the space, to the things that are in our environment, and then there's that kind of cognitive, kind of psychological, conscious articulation of what's going on. And I'm interested in the role of attention, emotion, and the underlying structures, but also by manipulating the stimulus features, by manipulating aspects of a film or a VR experience and seeing its effect on these things, then as a psychologist I can learn a lot. One of the things I'm interested in as well, you might know of the uncanny valley, and this idea that the more realistic something becomes, the more comfortable we feel about it until a point, and then it starts to become a little bit creepy. But that raises this issue that when it goes beyond that point, if you look at that graph, apparently that goes back up to normal, right? So that if someone here was a really good android of some sort, and that actually we wouldn't notice it. And that when CGI starts to get really impressive, I just picked these today as a quick example, that we don't, it's not about, oh, we do feel really comfortable, or we are less creeped out. In fact, it's harder to articulate our feelings, and they're probably a lot more diverse when they become more realistic, which is the same as our feelings towards a real person who looked like this. Yes, so some of my work, I'm just going to move through some of these ideas. Some of my work shows that our perceptual system adapts very quickly to do it depending on the stimulus. And so sometimes if we're in a virtual reality experience, for example, our perceptual system can adapt and can be updated really quickly. And so some of those fine details aren't necessarily very important. And then that brought me on to my interest around entertainment media, because entertainment media is full of all of these, like it's rich in these nearly real experiences, and they're real and not real in different sorts of ways. And so, like I said, we manipulate elements of the stimuli and then evaluate these things in the user or the viewer. And so I picked out one study to give you a sense of my work. Oh yeah, sorry, in the Media Lab in UCD, what I was trying to say is we use a range of different measures as well, because often the problem in this work is that people are conceptualizing something like emotion as just a response to a questionnaire or just a physiological measure. So we're trying to use multiple measures. And so in addition to the traditional self-report measures and qualitative methods, we also use eye tracking technology and physiological responses to kind of dynamic information. Okay, so some of the work that I've done based on that was around, I started simple, it was a couple of years ago, previous research hadn't looked at just this simple difference between 2D and 3D film and people's emotional responses towards that. I particularly chose horror and disgust as an emotion to hone in on, and I divided people into two groups, and half of them saw the 2D film and half of them saw the 3D film. There's some details there, I guess, just that they were individually tested in the lab. We used polygraph measures. We recorded a baseline. But also, it was a couple of years ago, people might say, yeah, well, maybe if you find a difference between those two groups, it's because the 3D group are in this more novel situation. It's nothing to do with that it's more realistic. It's just a little bit different or interesting. So we were able to record their response to just 3D images that weren't emotional as another baseline. And then both groups saw the same film scenes, and they completed these self-report measures. We were already collecting their physiological responses. We picked some, like I said, horror and disgust sorts of stimuli, and yeah, these are the results. Kind of regretting this slide at the moment. There's a lot of information, but I wasn't quite sure how to pitch it. I know it's a diverse group. The short version of this is that along the left are all the things I measured. Heart rate and skin conductance are at the top. And then there are two columns in the middle which are the means for the 2D group and the 3D group. And then there's inferential statistics at the side. It's a simple t-test. We found no difference between the groups in terms of their skin conductance, their self-reported emotional arousal, how sensitive the groups were to disgusting images. It was important that we measure that. Their engagement with the experience, their age, how much TV they watch, those sorts of things. There was no difference. But we found a significant difference between the group in terms of how realistic they reported the experience was, just on a self-report measure. And the 3D group had a significantly higher heart rate than the 2D group from baseline. But they didn't report it was a more emotional experience. Instead, there was no difference in their reports. And so in summary, what I'm trying to say is that there are these automatic and unconscious bodily responses towards the 3D depth. More recent research has suggested that 3D is better at holding our attention than 2D, I guess. And one of the things I was trying to say is that the fact that there was a difference in heart rate and not in skin conductance is particularly interesting, because skin conductance is directly linked to our parasympathetic nervous system. And that's I've said that wrong. Skin conductance is linked to our sympathetic nervous system, and that's our fight and flight response. It's our emotional kind of jump out of the way, emotional arousal experience. Whereas our parasympathetic nervous system is calm down, pay attention, concentrate, or regulate your emotional experience. Okay, so skin conductance, I'm never really great at explaining this, I'm sorry, you'll have to bear with me. So skin conductance, there was no difference between them, and that suggests there was no difference in their emotional arousal. But there was a difference in heart rate, and heart rate is innervated by both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So logical reduction suggested that it was their parasympathetic nervous system that was the source of the difference between the groups. The point of this is I'm saying that the 3D film compared to the 2D film seemed to affect the participants' ability to calm themselves down or regulate their experience, rather than the amount of emotion they felt in the first place. And the point of this research was that 3D is directly bypassing that conscious cognitive process. And it makes sense, our body responds to space. I might never remember that I moved to avoid this table as I walk past it, but unconsciously we have to be aware of the things that are in our space. So there are these unconscious automatic responses, and I was really interested in that idea. But other researchers were as well. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, people who are doing research at Disney have showed that, and other researchers in more academic institutions are showing that people's audience responses to these blockbuster Hollywood movies are really synchronous. So that their behavior, their emotional arousal, their physiological arousal, and their eye movements tend to be very similar, regardless of the viewers. And this suggests that these films are able to capture our attention, and the filmmakers are able to use these techniques to control your attention, I guess, as a viewer. Coupled with my research that suggested that there's these automatic unconscious responses to the film, it suggests that there's this tyranny of film. And that's a term used by colleagues from another similar but more academic group, the SCSMI, and they say the filmmakers are really good at controlling where you look, right? And now these new technological developments that are capturing your attention and more realistic, I'm arguing they're not just controlling where you look, but they're capturing your attention and holding. And that's all well and good, but I guess based on some other research, which I'll talk in a while about, I guess that just gives the film its best chance at winning you over. It doesn't necessarily mean it makes a good film, because there are those unconscious automatic responses, and at the same time we have a role to play in this, and we have that cognitive emotion regulation. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but I did a follow-up research study where I basically just asked people if they could try and remain detached. And then another group were told to try and try and get as involved as possible in this film. And then I asked them later to try and give me a sense of what sort of strategies that they used to do that. And I also asked them whether they found it difficult or not. And the people who were in the detached condition said, they tried all sorts of things, and those strategies were interesting in and of themselves. And the involved group said that they tried things. But what I thought was particularly interesting, and the point I'm trying to make here, is that the people in the involved group said, I didn't really have to do very much. I just had to kind of commit to the film, and it did the rest. Whereas in the detached condition, they found themselves forgetting the instructions quite often. Oh yeah, I forgot I'm not supposed to be getting involved. Now, it was a dark room, much like the way we watch films. But that idea that once the experience is presented to us, we can make efforts to cognitively regulate what happens. And I thought of it like the viewer is trying to find this right balance, the optimal psychological distance from the film. Losing the right amount of control was what I thought. Because for a film to be useful, for it to be magical, for us to get what we want from films, we need to get lost. It needs to have an effect on us. We need to believe in some way that it's real, or that these events have some sort of implications for me. But at the same time, we obviously need to remain in control. And we're really good at that. We do it all the time in everyday life. But film then just gives us a bit of a challenge. And my suggestion is that moving film into this 3D world may increase that challenge. I don't know. There's very little research. Oh yeah, I should have picked out what I was talking about. But just this idea that like as technology increases, that we may lose control. And I hate moral panic. I think these technological developments are really exciting, and I wouldn't blame technology for making people kind of addicted to VR. But I do think, I'm going to throw in a now Spider-Man reference and say, with great power comes great responsibility. And as people who are designing these technologies, we also have to know that, I guess, that that these technologies and films and stories do capture people's hearts and can have this tyrannical effect. I just thought I'd end with some other ideas. So, as I was saying, VR and film can readily provide a compelling illusion. It's really good at that. That's its job. And these drives automatic unconscious responses in the viewer. But I like this quote that sometimes strong emotion towards fiction requires goodwill on the part of the viewer to cooperate with the experience. In some cases, the viewer must actively search for the emotional value of an experience. And I thought that captures that idea. Some of you may have seen a trailer for a film recently and just decided already you're going to like it. That film doesn't have to do too much, perhaps. It just doesn't have to disappoint you. Whereas there's other ones where you may have already decided that you're not going to like it, for whatever reason. And I just think that demonstrates that we do have a role to play in this experience. I also like this idea that if this is the case, that often the most effective game and filmmaking techniques are those that go unnoticed, and that as a technician or a filmmaker working in this area, so much work goes into the idea of making these things unnoticed. I saw I was using Friday the 13th Part 3 as one of the 3D films, and at one point in it, one of the main characters is hanging up clothes, but I guess they really wanted to show that it was a 3D film. And he decided to turn to the camera and just put this stick out. And it just broke the whole illusion. It just showed that it was a gimmick. And I think films that are moving away from that, like The Martian and Gravity, are trying to hide the gimmicks of the techniques. I'd be interested to hear if you have thoughts on that. But I also thought it was interesting that we can't completely rely on self-reports if people don't say that it was a more emotional experience, whether heart rate is higher or lower. Self-reports aren't maybe the best way to know if this stuff is working. But then at the same time, I'm thinking, well, does the other stuff matter? If you're using this experience and you're not saying it's better than something else, then maybe it's only self-reports that matter. And then just to say, like I've suggested already in the TEDx talk that I spoke about, I've mentioned how we do have that responsibility around designing this stuff, and I'm not even sure what that might mean. I don't have a way to guide people. But if people can become overwhelmed during these experiences or can get lost, then I think we need to at least start asking the question around how realistic should something be. And I don't have an answer to that. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it too. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time or anything like that, but that's basically kind of what I was going to say. So.
Yeah, plenty of time for
Thanks. I could mention that I had some bonus slides, little Easter eggs or something, I don't know. But I just thought that some of this stuff is relevant to. So this is a collaborative project. I'm working with colleagues in Europe and an animator in IADT, and we're inserting close-up images into pre-existing films to see people's reaction towards those. Because, like I said, we're trying to find stimuli that aren't lab stimuli, aren't psychology kind of completely controlled, emotionless things to engage with. And in order to do that, we need to be collaborating with people from the industry who make these sorts of technologies. But then at the same time, as psychologists, we need to be able to control the way in which they're manipulated so as to isolate effects. Science kills the magic. So we need to be able to kind of quantify those sorts of manipulations. And then another thing that I think this is relevant for is the data visualization and processing. That more and more data is becoming that kind of. I mean, I could try and explain something to you in 10 different ways, and there's this element of realism or naturalness that could be added to an experience, and instantly we might understand. And it's not. And if it's just slightly wrong, it's like that uncanny valley stuff. It can be creepy or it doesn't work. But when we start to add this realism or naturalness and get it right, you don't need words actually. That automatic unconscious processing kicks in and you understand an idea or a concept. And some very basic examples that you might be familiar with already, but how realism can help us understand the space and an idea. And so I guess that's another area that I think is particularly interesting and relevant to this work. But what I think has been missing in the interdisciplinary work is the role of emotion and attention and the way in which we define and conceptualize emotion. So that's definitely that.
Thanks for that. Great. We'll turn it over for questions. Anyone?
I'm interested about education, or maybe when the viewer analyze when he is tricked or not. Because since I'm